All right, people, it's Menenberg again, and I am joined once more by Mr. Bazant, our APUSH expert, and Mr. Ellinger, our AP Euro teacher. I, of course, teach AP Modern World History, as you well know, and sometimes loathe. We are going to go through the LEQ rubric in this video. In our previous video, we kind of gave some basic tips and some common errors that occur or we've experienced with our students. In this one, we're going to tell you, like, if we were taking this test, here's how we would tackle this rubric. And as we mentioned in the earlier video, knowing this rubric is really, really important. You got to be familiar with what is required because, as I've stated so many times in class, this is your recipe for success. If you know what to do and what they're looking for, you're far more likely to do it than if you just kind of wing it and hope and pray that they're going to be smiling kindly on you. In any case, we'll start with Mr. Ellinger a little bit here. Let's tackle thesis. What was your question for Ellinger about thesis?
Well, what makes a good thesis, first and foremost, right? Could you just make a claim?
No.
And then get the point? So how would you elaborate on that?
So I think we all teach a similar structure, but we teach thesis as claim, evidence, and then a warrant. And then I'm going to make a small caveat for my kids. The warrant is this harkens back to my idea of like know your strengths and know your skills. If you're a really strong writer, especially in thesis, you could really develop warrant here. But you can get your thesis point by simply having a strong claim with evidence to support that claim. So once you've analyzed and watched the previous video, we talked about the prompt, the limitations, you've got good content. Now you make a claim. You answer the question. You provide evidence. You can't just say, Mr. Menenberg we were talking about this, lots of people make wild claims, but if you don't have evidence to support that in your thesis, you're not going to get that point. And for me, that's it. And then if you can, and this goes back, if you know your rubric and complexity, and then we're going to talk about contextualization in just a second, if you can add a link in there and connect that thesis and that claim to a broader idea, the warrant we call it, the so what, you're going to help yourself out for contextualization, but more importantly for your complexity stuff here.
Now, one thing I would add to what he said about when I'm including evidence in my thesis, that doesn't mean I'm giving those specific names and dates necessarily. It's more like categories, if you will, or overarching umbrellas of evidence that you're going to fill in the details in your body paragraphs. So don't go SAQ on this and give me a bunch of specific details up there in your thesis. I've seen students do this all the time early in the year, and what that ends up doing is selling yourself short for the later body paragraphs. That's where you really want to zero in on the details that you've studied and read about for the whole year. But you do want to kind of give those umbrellas, and I like to use the AP themes to kind of bookend those because it helps organize those thoughts. Do you agree with that, Mr. Bazant?
Yeah, absolutely. And we're using the language evidence, yes. Right? And we can have a whole video on what is evidence, right?
I do. I think I have 2 videos on that.
Okay, good job. You were trained well by your illustrious leader over here, your mentor, your friend, your colleague, Mr. Ellinger. But the AP rubric uses the language establish a line of reasoning,
yes.
Right? So this is my claim, and this is why I believe it, right? And then that becomes the basis and the structure of what you are writing. And you need to be hyper-focused on that, right? You don't want to deviate from your claim and your line of reasoning in your paper, right? You need to stay focused. So I think the term evidence could be problematic there and could be a little bit confusing for students at times. But so can a line of reasoning, right? And I think that's why we're having these conversations right now.
I think if I'm looking at my thesis statements over the years, that is probably the most often missed piece of that. The most often missed ingredient to a thesis is that line of reasoning. They'll just say such and such was the most significant cause of X or whatever. And that's it. You don't tell me why you believe that or why you're substantiating that claim.
So that's a claim.
That's a claim. That's no line of reasoning.
So the cause of the French Revolution. If you say the cause of the French Revolution was Louis XVI, Marie Antoinette, and the Third Estate, right? you've just listed 3 things. That's not evidence. Those are people or ideas or groups, right? So to Mr. Menenberg's point, the cause of the French Revolution was escalating economic or fiscal challenges, political disunity within the empire. You haven't named, that could be 2 or 3 smaller pieces of evidence, but you've categorized fiscal challenges. You're not just saying the economy, that's a little too broad, but you're specifying the cause of the French Revolution was fiscal challenges to the empire, political infighting, social unrest, all of which, and there's your warrant.
So in that case, all of which, or is that going to be your warrant, or is that going to be your line of reasoning? Because I think
that's the warrant.
I would argue that if you just had a thesis that was the first part of what you said, right? The causes of the French Revolution was, fiscal, unrest, or unstable economy, poor leadership, and class,
the shoe collection,
class antagonism, right? And class antagonism. So our 3 goals: political, social, and economic.
Right.
I don't know if that's enough to get you a point for your thesis. Because it's not establishing a line of reasoning.
I think that is the line of reasoning.
Well, you've made a claim, you've got your evidence, and within there, you've got those political, social, and economic lines of reasoning for it. I think you're right, and we always want to encourage, though, to go above and beyond because I think line of reasoning also can lead into the other piece that we're talking about, the complex piece, because you're looping back in your conclusion or wherever you're putting your complex understanding, that then you're corroborating, we'll get into those terms later.
Well, so what I do with that is I would say, here are my causes, right? And of those 3 causes, this one was the big one, if you will, or the most significant, as seen in this, and this. And that's the high bar thesis for my teaching. Remember, we don't aim for the low bar. You might read some College Board examples of this gets the thesis point, and you're like, where? Well, that's not how we play here. We play for keeps, we aim high, and we try to get all of the points guaranteed. And by doing this kind of methodology, you're more likely to get there. So let's move on, though. As we look at this rubric, remember, the thesis is listed first, but that doesn't necessarily mean it comes first. It should, as the rubric points out, come in the first or the last paragraph. That's where they're going to look for it. But I teach this.
Put it in the first.
No, I put it in the first, absolutely. But I also put it at the end of that first paragraph.
Yes.
Because the first paragraph should be contextualization. What that does for me is that sets my essay up to go, here's how we got here, is what it's basically answering. And
it's a funnel.
It's a funnel. I use the different funnel because it's more like the Star Wars slow crawl. That's what contextualization is, my friends. Always go back to Star Wars.
I'm on episode 6.
Here we go.
That's unrelated. A whole different video.
Can we focus for 30
lack
seconds?
Of cultural literacy is a whole different video.
It's upsetting.
Star Wars?
Please bring your comments and judgment on how he has gone his whole. How old are you now? 76 or 70?
Okay, let's get back on topic.
Thank you. Contextualization. What is contextualization? As I'm writing this essay, what does contextualization look like? Real quick, what do we need to put in there? How much do we need to write? How detailed does it need to be?
First and foremost, it's more than a phrase or a reference. Mm-hmm. It's your entire first paragraph, right? So I would say 5 to 7 sentences, right? It is your entire first paragraph where you are framing the question. You are framing your argument, right? You need to know enough about your issue, right, to contextualize, to use their words, right, your argument. Mm-hmm. So if it's causation, right, if the prompt is asking about causation, right, well then you need to figure out that time frame so that your reader understands what's going on around that event that got us there. Right? So if we're talking U.S. history, right? If we're looking at causation of the American Revolution, right? Be it social, political, economic, or philosophical causes, whatever the causes are, for my context, I'm probably going to start with 1754 and go all the way up to 1776, because that's going to get me from the French and Indian War, or the 7 Years' War in AP Euro language, all the way up to the Revolution. Right?
Yeah.
So I would limit my context to that time frame because that's when it really started to snowball.
And
Right.
that's a big error that a lot of students I see make is they go way too broad, especially as a teach world. Like you gotta, it's focused on the world of the prompt, right? Whether that's geographical or, as you said, kind of time frame wise. That's a really good way to do it. And don't go 100 years before, okay? Let's do a couple decades tops. And you're really helping the reader situate their mind and, like, again, how did we get to the world of the prompt?
Exactly.
That's what we're doing.
Yeah.
They again know why they're asking you to do this, because historians don't just live in vacuums and study events in isolation, right? That's the whole point of thematic work in this class, and looking at time periods and why we categorize history into time periods in the first place. It's just a quick check and a quick assessment that you know that this is not in isolation, and that you know what preceded it, you know maybe some of the nuance within it, and you know some of the things that happened after it. Yeah, it's 4, 5, 6 sentences.
So on that, so do you want to focus on what preceded it, what went during, or what went after the event, or does it depend on the type of question?
It depends on the prompt, and I know you're pointing at the rubric, and which it's or. So you don't have to do all 3 of those. If you can, do it, because we don't shoot for the low bar. And when you do shoot for the low bar, you're putting your hands into really tired, worn out teachers in a basement in St. Louis somewhere who are like, does this kid deserve the point or not? If you go above the bar, you're going to get that point. So, is it before, during, or after? If you can incorporate 1 or 2 of those, that would be great. All 3, you probably don't need to do that,
I think if you go into the essay with a plan of doing it one way, you're probably going to be successful at doing it that way. I tend to look at these prompts as a really easy tee up to causation. In other words, like if you're using causation as your means of contextualization, whatever the historical thing, even if it's a comparison prompt, causation will get you your contextualization point, because you're telling us what caused this, essentially. But that being said, for sake of time, let's continue on with evidence, analysis and reasoning and all that stuff. We don't need to go point by point, but just in terms of structure.
Yeah.
We talked about our first paragraph, contextualization and thesis. We talked about possibly including a conclusion paragraph with reiterating that thesis. What else would you suggest to our young students as they attempt to write this essay in a very short amount of time?
I'll start, and then I'll kick it over to Ellinger and you guys for discussion. I basically, for an LEQ, teach 4 paragraphs.
Okay.
Right? With the option of a 5th, and that's if you include a warrant in your thesis, right? Remember, you don't need a warrant in your thesis to get the thesis point. Your warrant is a 3-part thesis. College Board asks for a 2-part thesis, right? But that can get you that complexity point, which is, in my opinion, the most subjective part of the rubric.
The unicorn point, as they call it.
So I teach 4 paragraphs. All right, so you have your introductory paragraph, and that's going to tackle 2 of the 6 points. It's going to give you your context point and your thesis point. Your body paragraphs are then going to give you another 3 points, right? And that's where you develop your argument. And you incorporate your evidence and your analysis, and you are proving your thesis. You are proving that you understand what it is that you're talking about, right? And then your conclusion is where you address that so what. You extend it, right? To show us that you know more than just this topic. You understand how history corroborates with one another, right? How events, overlap and spiral and repeat, right? And are connected together, right? Nothing happens in a vacuum.
Well, that's connected. That's the key word, because this is where the rubric gets a little bit. There is a level of collective wisdom in how you decide, because you can either get 1 point for evidence or 2 points. 1 point is just kind of listing things and talking about them, and they're related to the topic, but they're not maybe connected tightly. Whereas 2 points is that connective tissue, that like this leads to this, or this is how all 3 of these are connected.
And this proves what I said.
Right, this is the argument that you have established. You're not just talking about, oh, well, this event happened and this person did this and oh, this has happened as well. If you don't have that connective tissue to link them together as an argument, this continues my initial thought that, you know, that's the two-pointer. And then that's also, I think, because remember, these are humans reading these, and if you're establishing a complex thesis and you're having these connective tissues, you're just building confidence in the reader that, man, this kid's on their way to that second, the unicorn point of the complex understanding. Because again, you've got the 2 points in your back pocket, 2 out of 6.
That's higher than the national average.
Which, I mean, even if you do not ever do this, we're not saying to, but even if you just stopped at thesis context, you've got a third of the points in your back pocket. They always go together in the intro, and then you just weave your evidence in there, and you got 4 points on the table. That's what's left to get. Do you do it in a simplistic manner and get your 2 points? Do you get the connective tissue, the connection, and then if you get that golden unicorn, you get all 4 of the remaining points.
And Menenberg, how many pieces of evidence do you need to use to get the point?
Ooh, this is a great question. And there's debate amongst good AP teachers on this. So you don't have to quote me here. I aim for the high bar. I tell my students 8 to 12. And here's what I mean by that. I mean like 8 names and places, dates, that kind of thing. Specific things I can nail down, time and place and all that. And the reason I say that is because so often, and this is a high bar.
It is high.
The reason I say that though is because when you're under the gun, so to speak, of the clock and the stress and all that, there's a good chance you're going to screw up a couple of those. And remember, you're graded on an asset-based basis. And that means that if they get a couple of these wrong, they're going to ignore that and take whatever is remaining. So the chances of you getting those evidence points increases by putting more of it on paper. And so here's again, you guys have worked your butts off all year reading the textbook, taking all the notes that we make you take. Show us what you know. You have enough time if you did the pre-write that we have suggested you do. Watch that earlier video. You have that information. So why not put it on paper? Now, if they are going through, they're not tallying up 1, 2,
No, they're
3.
not.
They're not. But we know it when we see it. This is somebody who knows their stuff. And if you only have 2 little nuggets like Marie Antoinette's shoe collection and, I don't know, the contributions the French made to the American Revolution that led to the French Revolution, that's only 2 little things. That doesn't demonstrate a comprehensive understanding of the topic.
No, but will it get you the evidence point?
It could. If you do, but again, now we come back to your skill as a writer, and what that is, it kind of depends on the prompt.
Yeah.
And I would say I'm happy with numbers, and I'm happy with setting students up for success by saying, do this, and do this. And 8 to 12 is fine. That is a bit high. I guess I would only say, don't beat yourself up if you can't get 8. Like a social question, like from the previous video that I read, like you might struggle to find 8 to 12 things there.
Right, and I guess that comes to how do we define evidence. So if I was talking about the women's rights movement, a social situation, right, and I talk about Seneca Falls counts as a piece of evidence, and then I also have
all the individuals.
the individuals might count as pieces of evidence.
Yeah.
That gets you 1 point.
Right. No,
Now, what role did that Seneca Falls Convention play
That gets you
in
a
the women's rights movement, right? And then, if you want that complexity point connected to the civil rights movement that was going on simultaneously,
Yes,
right?
absolutely.
That can get you that complexity point, even though it's a different topic.
Yep, it's related on the social end of things. Now, we're running short on time, so I want to kind of finish up with a couple of quick things. Speaking of time, let's say that you're in the test mode and you have 15 minutes to go, or 20 minutes to go, let's just say that, and you got to start the essay from that point. You mismanaged your DBQ and you got 20 minutes left to write this essay. What do you do? Besides panic. You're not going to panic because you're well trained.
No, their brains are mush at that point, so there's very little.
And your hand is tired.
Your hand is cramping.
Here's what I do in that situation. I take a deep breath. I refocus.
Yeah.
Right? Because your mind is your biggest weapon
Yeah.
here, right? You need to stay focused, all right? I got 15, 20 minutes to write this. How do I maximize this? Well, for me, it's that intro.
Yep. Intro.
Knock that intro
Yes.
out.
10
Get
minutes.
those 2 points.
Get
10
your
minutes,
2.
right?
I agree. Get your 2.
Get your 2 points. And that's going to put you somewhere in that mix of that, I mean, what was the average of that last one, right?
I think the average LEQ score is somewhere between a 1 and a 2 nationally. So yeah, that's not great.
That's horrible.
But so here's where my students get tripped up on this. I don't know about Molly Terrace so much, but my students take that 1 or 2 and they divide it by 6 and they're like, well, that's the percentage I got, that's the letter. No, it's not.
No.
It's weighted relative to the rest of the test.
Yeah.
And if you crank out a solid 2 in 10 to 15 minutes, 1, that's doable. 2, that's actually pretty respectable.
Well, and again, that I would hope that says you killed it on the DBQ because you spent so much time on it, which is a 7-point rubric. And remember, all of your scores are all added up as a point value with, you know, formulas for weighting and all that. But you got your multiple choice, your short answer, your DBQ, and your LEQ. So if you, that's why at that point, I hate saying it, it does become a point. Get the points you can. Get your 2. Maybe you could scrounge an evidence point in there if you're, you know, and then you're in high cotton, and you can add that into the other great work you've done, and your small little misstep on time isn't going to destroy you.
Now, on the flip side of that, what happens if you are managing your time, you think you're doing a really good job, and you are wrapping up your LEQ, you've written your beautiful conclusion statement, you're looking at your watch, you're like, I got 15 minutes left. I've had students enter this scenario, I have it happen on unit tests all the time, where they turn it in, I'm like, what are you doing? What do you do with that extra time? What would you tell our students to do with extra time?
There's a couple of things, right? But I'm going to defer to Ellinger here.
I mean, I don't want to know if if you have tons of time left over, because you can't do a rewrite, right?
No.
So at that point, you do a mental points rubric analysis for I'd go back to the DBQ, because that's a little bit more moving parts maybe, and those are only 2 things you can do, because the other one you don't have access to anymore. Maybe the short answers.
No, you don't have the short answers.
Short answers
Those are
are
the
the
first.
first
So
bucket.
you only have the DBQ and the LEQ. So I would go back and like make sure, I would probably do like, did I get my POV points for the DBQ?
Yeah.
Because there's just more moving parts in that one. And then go through your LEQ. All right, I got my 2, but then do I have a complexity piece? Write a conclusion. If you didn't write a conclusion,
Crank it out, yeah.
in fact, that would be, scratch whatever you did for a conclusion if it's rushed. And maybe if I was going to rewrite anything, it would only be my conclusion. And repeat
Your thesis.
double up. You know, just make sure that the reader, who's probably as tired, I mean, those AP readers, they read
60 seconds, they're done with their essay.
They are cranking out hundreds of these a day. So who knows who's reading at that point? They're good at it. They have norms, they have computers that make sure that they're all consistent, they're being read multiple times, but redo your conclusion.
So on that point, I would say you do one of 2 things, right? Number 1, exactly what Ellinger said. Go through the rubrics. See if you're missing any points, or if you're going to elaborate here or there, right? I would probably go to the DBQ versus the LEQ, because it's worth more points, and as a percentage of your overall test, it's
25%.
worth more.
And it's a little harder,
So
it's a little more structured.
I would go through, and then I would hunt for points, right?
Yep.
Double check your work. If you still got time, I would write more.
Yeah.
I would write more.
That's exactly what I want to say. Is like, do not put your head down and say you're done. I know it's been a long day. It's one of the longest tests you'll ever take. But come on, people. 15 more minutes, you can keep writing.
Yeah.
And the key is, if you keep writing, you just increase your chances of getting more points, whether it's on the LEQ or the DBQ. A DBQ is probably advisable with the percentage that it makes, but keep writing is the key.
Did you ever take a longer? I don't know that GRE,
I don't think
exams.
I've taken 3-hour tests.
What
and
was
this
our
is
national board test?
3 hours?
That was
3 hours.
The content?
Yeah. I took 2. I mean, I finished early. In any case, we're kind of running out of time here, and certainly running out of batteries.
Can I address one more point just for the audience really quickly?
Got to get the last word every time.
Well, no, I want to get your guys' perspective on this, and it's part B of the rubric, right? Analysis and reasoning. And the first point is using historical reasoning. Comparison, causation, continuity over change over time. Is this point earned within a phrase or a sentence in your essay, or is it a breadth of the entire paper?
I think it's a collective thing. I think it's using that type of language. This was a cause, and then this was an effect. That type of language that is tied to those historical thinking skills. The more often they see those types of words, it just kind of seeps into the reader's brain.
Yeah.
They framed it this way. It's not that hard to follow. It's not one massive paragraph. It's this paragraph and this, and it logically flows.
I would say that's an easy point to get.
Easy point to get.
Well, it's because again, it goes back to the prompt, because it's the historical thinking. It's the, right? Comparison and contrast, causation and effect, continuity and change over time. That's embedded in the prompt, which you have addressed in your thesis, where you establish a line of reasoning. So if you use historical reasoning, line of reasoning and thesis, again, everything's connected.
It's connected.
Exactly.
So
And it
if
should
you've
be
got
easy.
that, it's all, I know we say
Exactly.
you can't double dip, but if you've established a line of reasoning in your thesis, then conceivably used evidence to further that, compare and contrast, cause and effect, continuity or change over time, then you're gonna get it.
It's
You're
the
gonna-
framework.
It's not a
It's the-
sentence
yeah,
you write.
it's the framework of the
they
entire
did
essay.
it. It's the how you frame.
It's
exactly.
how you make the reader feel at the end of the essay. In any case, we are out of time for
On
this.
that note.
I hope this has been helpful. It's been helpful to me. It's been great to see these guys. In any case, write questions, comments, let us know how we can help going forward. And remember, my friends, life is about
Choices.
choices. We'll see you next time.